Greetings, citizens. Hey you beautiful creepy little human being, you. Welcome to my channel and welcome to today's Morbid makeup video. I'm so happy we could meet like this. I'm so happy that somehow in all of this craziness, okay, today you and I were able to find each other on this crazy little planet that we call home. My name is Brittany or BRATTERSTEIN, whichever you prefer, and today we're going to be discussing the absolutely tragic double murder and suicide of the Benoit family at the hands of Chris Benoit, the husband and the father. But before we get started, if you have not yet had the pleasure, please make sure to join the Brat Pack by subscribing and ringing that bell. I put out a new video every single week, sometimes 2 a week, and I would love to hang out with you. Yes, you specifically you, but I can only do that if you join the Brat Pack and become one of us. One of us. One of us. One of us. And you can also follow me on Instagram and Twitter if you want. They're both BRATTERSTEIN, but no pressure. So now that I'm done essentially begging you to join my cult, we can go ahead and get into the story. Now, this is a story that's been on my list to do for a while. This is a story that was actually suggested by a subscriber named Brooke. So hi, Brooke. Thank you, Brooke. And it's the type of story that, though I didn't know a ton about prior to researching it, it is infamous among a certain group of people, and that is people who were a fan of wrestling on TV, professional wrestling, particularly in the 90s. My husband being one of those fans. And that's because at the time that these murders were committed, Chris Benoit was one of the main wrestlers for the WWE, and though he was considered a veteran at the time of the murders, he was still doing performances, and he was a name that put the meat in their respective seats. That was until June of 2007 when Chris Benoit murdered his wife and his young son before taking his own life in the home that the family shared in Georgia. So this is not it's a rough story. Family annihilator stories are always a rough story. With that said, I'm going to tell you the whole story today, and while I do, I'm going to be putting on a full face of makeup, hence the makeup in Morbid makeup. And if that's not really your thing, that's okay. Thanks for hanging out this long. I hope you find a channel that covers a story that you like more. But if you're kind of on the fence, like, I'm not sure how I feel, maybe stick around. I think you could be surprised by how much you like me and also the process. People are often surprised by the digestibility this format seems to bring to these horrible situations. So let's just get into it. Come, gather around, and let me tell you the story of the horrible double murder suicide of the Benoit family. I want to start off this particular story in this video with a quote from Vince McMahon that he gave after this horrible crime happened. There was no indication whatsoever that this man could turn into this monster and do what he did. On June 25th, 2007, police received a call that sent them to a home in Georgia, and that call came in from a man named Dennis. Dennis was a retired New York detective, and at the time he was running security for World Wrestling, and he informed the dispatcher when he called the police that one of his wrestlers was MIA, had been acting really weird, and that he was worried about him and would like a welfare check performed, and this wrestler was 40-year-old Chris Benoit. When police arrived at that home, they found a terrible scene. It was determined that over a 3-day period between June 22nd and June 24th of 2007, Chris Benoit had killed his wife Nancy and his 7-year-old son Daniel before killing himself. Nancy was killed first, presumably on the 22nd. She was tied up, all of her extremities, her hands, legs were all tied up, and she had been killed by strangulation. 7-year-old Daniel was killed the next day. He was killed in his own bed, and he too died from asphyxiation. And Bibles were found by both of the two victims' bodies. The following evening, after spending those days in the home with his dead wife and his dead son, Chris Benoit went into his weight room and he hung himself from his lat pull-down machine. The trio were found in their Georgia home at about 2:30 p.m. on June 25th, 2007. And as soon as the news broke of this tragedy, the entire wrestling community, all the fans, everybody who knew who he was completely blown away that this seemingly calm man who was known for his even temper and his love for his family could commit such a horrible crime. They were completely blown away that he could do something like this. It was not in his nature at all, based on what everyone who knew him said. Christopher Michael Benoit was one of 2 children born to Michael and Margaret Benoit and was born in Montreal, Quebec on May 21st, 1967, making him a Gemini. Well, a Gemini Taurus cusp, but whatever. From the time he was a young boy, he was obsessed with wrestling, becoming obsessed with the Dynamite Kid, even stylizing some of his moves when he started wrestling himself after the kids. Chris decided pretty young that wrestling was what he wanted, so he started taking wrestling classes and practicing bodybuilding all throughout his school career whenever the options were available. When he was a teenager, he started training at a wrestling school called the Heart Dungeon, and this must have been a huge thing for him because the halls of the school had been walked by numerous of Chris's pro wrestling idols that he had when he was growing up. With all of this early interest, it made total sense that he followed his childhood idols into the Wrestling Hall of Fame as the Canadian Crippler. He first debuted in his wrestling career when he was 18 years old in Calgary, Alberta, and by the 2000s he was a fast-rising wrestling star and had made himself a place in the WWF, which was formerly known as the WWE, but at some point they got their acronym stolen, so then they became the WWF. Chris rose into a massive superstar in wrestling due to his technical abilities and also his willingness to just take a punch, dude. He would take so many hits because he just wanted to put on the best show he could, but because of this, he suffered from numerous concussions, and Chris himself said that he had had so many concussions in his life that he couldn't even count them and had more than any person should have probably ever sustained. But he did it all for the show. He wanted you to have a good time watching. So he was like, F it, what's the worst that could happen? And here we are. I wasn't aware of this when I first got started researching this case, but freaking Chris Benoit was like a really, really big deal. I thought he was like one of many, which I mean he was, but he was actually one of the most famous at the time. He fought against a lot of people whose names you might recognize, like John Cena, The Rock, somebody else. I didn't watch wrestling. Wait a minute. Steve Austin. 316. My husband has a shirt that has 316 on the back, so I know that that's something. And he fought against all those guys who are still very relevant human beings to this day. And he ended up getting awarded a ton of really cool nicknames. He was the Wild Pegasus, the Pegasus Kid, Dynamite Kid, and the Canadian Crippler, and he even ended up being the winner of the World Heavyweight Championship for the WWE. So he had a lot of accomplishments in wrestling. I was not a wrestling fan, but from what I discussed with my husband and also one of the attorneys at my office, this was a big effing deal. Everyone says, like, he was the real deal meal ticket. So at the time of the murders, he was one of, the best of the best in the WWE/WWF. But at the time, he was considered in the veteran stage of his wrestling career because he was 40 now. And, your body can't take quite as many hits. But he did still put on performances. And his name was still somebody who would draw in crowds. It was still something he was doing. He was just doing it a little bit less. He was kind of on the down slope, which does happen when you have a career. Well, there's a lot of different careers, but particularly it's a physical career and your body can only take so much as you get older. That's just facts. Or is that just my opinion? I think it's facts. But he was known as being one of the best technical wrestlers of his generation. Chris was just known as being an elite athlete with a career in wrestling that spanned over 2 decades, and he was known as being one of the best and most popular and most dedicated in his field. And it was actually wrestling that would introduce Chris Benoit to his second wife, Nancy. So let's talk about Nancy a little bit. Nancy Benoit was born Nancy Tafalone in Massachusetts on May 17th, 1964. Which, does that make her a Taurus too? Oh, wait. Chris was a Gemini Taurus cusp and Nancy was a Taurus. For anyone who cares about that. Nancy was married once straight out of high school, but the marriage didn't last long. She ended up meeting and getting in close with wrestlers in the area she lived, though I do not know how one does that. But she did do that, and she actually ended up even being the cover model for an issue of this magazine called Wrestling All-Stars in 1984 when she was recommended by a photographer. From there, she ended up getting a job as a man named Kevin Sullivan, her second husband, actually. He became her second husband later. Well, she got a job as his manager. So she was a manager, a model, and even ended up doing wrestling herself for a couple of years as a woman. And I think she was also like Fallen Angel was her other one. But a lot of reports just refer to her and her career as woman. Which is, in my humble opinion, probably the toughest wrestling name of all time. You let me know what you think. At the time that Nancy met Chris, she was still married to her second husband, as I stated. This was a man named Kevin Sullivan, and she was working as a booker and an agent for the WCW with the name just simply Woman, as I stated. So at the time that Chris and Nancy became acquainted with each other, what was happening is that the company that Chris worked for, the wrestling company, wanted to kind of incite a little rivalry, like a fake rivalry to the crowd between Chris Benoit and Nancy's husband, Kevin Sullivan. So the way they did this is there was rumors passed around that Chris and Nancy were having an affair, though at the time they were not. But it was being passed around that they were having an affair. They would go on little trips together. They would hang out. They'd be photographed together. And this was supposed to make it so that when Chris and Kevin would wrestle against each other, it would be real gnarly because they had something to fight about. But at the time, Nancy was married to Kevin, so that was happening. That was cool. And Chris was actually married at that time to his first wife, Martina. Since they were both in respective relationships, it was cool that they were kind of faking having a relationship on the side to make views better for audiences. But life started to imitate art a little bit when, after months of Chris and Nancy having their little fake affair, they would even go on trips together, go off alone together, be photographed holding hands and being real cuddly, They did end up having an affair. And Chris's wife Martina was like, this, and she actually took his kids, because he had 2 kids with her, which I think I forgot to mention, and went back to Canada, and then Nancy divorced Kevin. So once the two were together, things moved relatively quickly. I mean, it kind of depends on your opinion, but Nancy and Chris ended up welcoming their first and their only child that they would have together on February 25th, 2000. And this was a boy that they named Daniel. And later that year, I believe in November or December of the same year, the two married. So now we're moving back to the murders. And as I said, Chris was known for being very professional. That was one thing that you could say. He was very professional in his career, and he never missed a show. So it was very weird when a friend and coworker of Chris's received a text from him at about 3:30 on June 23rd, 2005, saying that Chris had overslept a little bit and was actually going to be late for the WWE SmackDown that was going to be happening in Texas that day. And it was going to be happening that night. He was waking up and texting at 3:30 saying, I'm going to be late for an event that's happening that night in Texas that he was supposed to be participating in. The friend that Chris spoke to said that most of the conversation seemed normal. He just seemed a little groggy, a little tired. But one thing that was notable about the conversation is that before Chris got off the phone with him, he told him that he loved him. And this was weird because it wasn't something Chris normally did. And it wasn't just what he did and what he said. It was the way he said it. He sort of like stopped the conversation and was like, no, listen, bro, I love you, before hanging up. And this guy thought that that was weird enough that after getting off the phone and letting it kind of process in his brain, he's like, that seems off. So we actually tried calling him back, but Chris didn't answer the phone. So he left a message or sent him a text. I can't remember. He gave him the message of, dude, just call me back. Because he was like, this is weird. I don't like this. Which, I don't know. Me and my friends say I love you all the time before hanging up, but if that wasn't commonplace, I could see how that would stress somebody out and worry them a little bit. Shortly after that friend left the message for Chris saying to call back, Chris actually did call him back and was like, yo, sorry bro that I didn't answer. I was actually on the phone with Delta Airlines. Delta Airlines, this life is a fucking nightmare. No, he was on the phone with Delta Airlines changing his flight so that he could try to make it later to the WWE SmackDown, blah, blah, blah. He also said that he was super stressed out because Nancy and Daniel, his wife and son, had been suffering from food poisoning all day. So that's part of why he was sleeping. He had been up all night with them. They were really sick. And it turns out another friend had actually talked to Chris that day too. And Chris had told this friend that Nancy and Daniel had actually been throwing up blood. So now we're on to the next day, June 24th, 2007. And in the early hours of that day, Chris started sending messages to different staff members of the WWE, telling them that he may be late to the Night of Champions that was happening that night. So it was like 2 nights of shows where he was headlining to fight against a man named CM Punk. But he told them, his coworkers, that he doesn't know if he's going to be able to make it. He's probably going to be late. He's going to do his best. But that his son Daniel was in the hospital because he was throwing up blood, and that him, Chris, and his wife Nancy were there with their son at the hospital. So over these days, Chris was in communication with a couple of people, giving them different stories of what was happening. And it seems like he was just trying to buy a little time He was saying things were wild. He was saying that his wife was sick, that his child was sick, that he was going to do his best to try to be there. He might just be late, but he'd make it to Houston. Like, it was a lot of different stories. But then, the next day, on June 25th, when he still didn't show up, people started kind of getting together, comparing notes of what he said, and realizing that things seemed off and that something was likely wrong. And this was strengthened by the fact that some of Chris's friends in the WWF wrestling team got some very cryptic text messages the night of the 24th into the early morning hours of the 25th. Around 4 a.m. on the 25th, so it was the 25th, not the early morning hours of the 24th to the 25th, I checked into it. Chris sent 3 of his coworkers some weird text messages. The first one contained his home address, and the second one said, and I quote, "The dogs are in the enclosed pool area. Garage side door is open." So people found this to be really weird. Why would he be sending out his address, and why would he be sending out people instructions to either find or avoid his dog? So they freak out and they try to get in contact with Chris. They start calling him, they start texting him. They even start calling hospitals in the Atlanta area, just trying to find him, since he had said he'd been at the hospital, just trying to see what was going on. But they were never successful in locating Chris. That is when the cops were called, the welfare check was requested, and the 3 bodies were found. Nancy was found in an upstairs bedroom. She was tied up, her wrists and her ankles were tied, and a towel was wrapped around her head, and there was a puddle of blood found beneath her face. Next to her laid a Bible. Injuries and bruising on her back and stomach indicated that Chris, her husband, had pressed a knee into her back as he pulled up on a cord from behind, strangling her to death. This is her husband. There were no signs of a struggle. Alcohol was found in Nancy's body, but it was at a level that was undetermined. It was undetermined if this was alcohol she had consumed or if it was a result of the normal decomposition process of the body. Because apparently when your body decomposes, you release alcohol into your blood. I'm not a scientist, I'm not a doctor, but this is what I've read, and this is what happened in this case. Maybe. They couldn't tell which way it went. It was a good sentence. English is my first language. My only language. Because I am uncultured. The decomposition of her body also made it difficult for the examiner to estimate the pre-death levels of hydrocodone and alprazolam that were found in Nancy's body at therapeutic levels. The medical examiner found no evidence that Nancy was drugged or sedated or incapacitated before she was killed. Which I think is why they were looking for alcohol and drugs in her system, was to see if she was drugged before she was killed. And it was determined that she was not. During the murder investigation, it actually was found out that in 2003, Nancy had tried to get a restraining order against Chris and had tried to file for divorce, claiming that the marriage was irrevocably broken and alleging cruel treatment. It was said that Nancy claimed that Chris would threaten to hit her and would destroy things around the home when he was upset, and that she feared for her life and the life of her son Daniel. But at some point she ended up actually dropping the divorce and not going through with the restraining order either. It was also found while investigating this case that on the night of June 22nd, 2007, so the night that Nancy was presumably killed, at about 10 p.m., someone from the Benoit home had actually tried calling information and had requested the non-emergency number for the police department. No one knows why. No one knows who made this call, which I thought was weird that it wouldn't have been recorded to know if it was Nancy or Chris. But either way, whoever requested the number never called the non-emergency police department phone number, and then shortly thereafter, Nancy was killed. So it just makes you wonder. It really makes you wonder what was going on in that house that night. Was that Nancy, suspecting that something was off with Chris and wanting to be able to do something? Or was that Chris maybe wanting to stop himself? We have no idea. And we can't ask anybody because they're all, unfortunately, deceased now. Medical examiners were unable to determine the exact time that young Daniel Benoit was killed. Daniel had internal injuries to his throat, but there was no soft tissue damage on the outside, no bruising. So it was thought that Daniel was probably killed by his father in a chokehold, which would literally mean that he had his son's neck and like the crook of his arm, and that's how he murdered him. The reports did determine that Daniel was sedated with Xanax and was likely unconscious when he was killed, which is something, I guess, and Daniel's body had also started to show signs of decomposition, but it was not as far along as the decomp in his mother's body, which means he was killed after her, a good amount of time after, and when his body was found, there was a Bible laying next to him as well. This in particular was really weird for people because Chris was known as being a man who like loved his son and like put this boy on a pedestal. He was said to even like if Daniel was at his wrestling matches, if he would win, he would like get him and like hold him up, and like he like cherished his child. So it was really hard for people to wrap their minds around the fact that he would kill him and in such like a personal and intense way. I mean, I guess the fact that he was sedated is something that shows a little bit of mercy, but it's like, what the fuck, man? Daniel Benoit was said to have been born with a genetic disability, and I think that this comes up so often when you're researching this case as maybe like a reason that the couple would fight, some sort of stressor on the family, but it's unclear to this day what that genetic disability was. It's been widely rumored that he suffered from Fragile X syndrome, which can affect the way a child's brain development and can also cause physical and mental developmental disabilities. But family members that were close to the family have denied that Daniel actually did have Fragile X syndrome, and teachers reported that he had no developmental delays and was on par with other students his age. He was just like a little bit small. But it's still unclear exactly what, if anything, was wrong with his health, and the Benoit family was pretty tight-lipped about what was wrong with him, if anything, when he was alive. What sort of perpetuated the rumor about the Fragile X syndrome is that there was another rumor that when Daniel's body was found, he had like needle marks in his arm, and it was theorized that this was because Chris Benoit had been injecting his son with growth hormones to combat the Fragile X syndrome. But this has never been proven, obviously, but it is said a lot in this case. It's just this theory that people throw out. So like a lot of people just believe that it's fact and that it is true, but it hasn't actually been proven to be true. A friend of Chris's, another wrestler named Chris Jericho, did say that if Chris wanted to keep something private, then he would have easily been able to do so. So it's possible that he was doing this and hiding it, but who knows? Doctors were not able to confirm or deny because if there was testosterone in young Daniel's body, because at the time that he was killed and when his body was recovered, there was no urine left in his system. So it's just a theory, but there is no proof. And what I think is super weird, actually, is that after all this time, there's no records, like medical records, indicating one way or the other, like what his developmental disability was, because I would imagine that he would have been to the doctor and that they would have had a record of that, but it's never been released to like combat these rumors and these theories, which I think is a little odd. But it really hardly matters, because what will knowing that solve? Nothing. Chris Benoit took his own life by using a weight machine cord to hang himself by creating a noose from the end of the cord on the pull-down machine from which the bar would normally hang, but he had removed the bar. Chris then released the weights, which were about 240 pounds, which was more than he weighed, and it caused his strangulation. He was found seated against the machine. All 3 members of the Benoit family were found with substances in their system at the time of death. Nancy was found with hydrocodone, hydromorphone, and Xanax in her system, but the levels were found to be consistent with therapeutic use and not abuse, and definitely not enough to incapacitate her. As I said before, she also did have alcohol in her blood, but it was unclear if this was from drinking alcohol or from the body's normal decomposition process. Young Daniel was found with Xanax in his system, which would be a very strange drug to give a kid of 7 years old, and it was found to be enough in his system to incapacitate him, so it's thought that Chris Benoit gave his child some mercy by drugging him before he murdered him. Chris Benoit was found with Xanax and hydrocodone in his system, but these, like with Nancy, were at therapeutic levels. There were also elevated levels of testosterone found in his urine, but no artificial steroids were found in his system. And he was also tested and came back negative for blood alcohol. The Monday after the murders was meant to be WWF Monday Night Raw, but in light of what happened, they actually canceled that programming and they put on a tribute to Chris Benoit's life. Not his wife's and his child's life, but Chris Benoit's life. And I'd like to think, I'm pretty sure that at the time they didn't know the details of what had happened. So at the time, the tribute to him made sense because he was one of their wrestlers. But soon after that, the details did come out of what happened, and I'm sure that they regretted it. And I'm sure that this tribute ended up putting a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths, because when I heard it, it definitely made me go, But as soon as they found out the details, they pivoted so hard and so fast, and they tried to put as much distance as physically, humanly possible between them, the association, and Chris Benoit and his crime. They removed Chris Benoit from everything. They got rid of all the matches that he was ever in and just sort of pretended that he had never existed. The name Chris Benoit was omitted from all merchandise, promotional materials, and past history. All of his accomplishments were expunged, plus all active and former wrestlers and staff and executives of the WWF/WWE were even banned from bringing up his name at all. They were like, listen, he was not here. We do not talk about Chris Benoit. They just really wanted to distance themselves from the whole thing. That's probably because when it happened, there was a lot of buzz pretty quickly about steroid use possibly being a theory for what happened, and also the head injuries that you sustain being a wrestler. And they just wanted to not be associated with these types of rumors. But speaking of these theories, rumors, speculations, let's get into the theories of the why. Because that's the biggest question here for most people who have heard of this case. So there are many theories as to the why in this case, and people have to theorize because Chris didn't leave a suicide note. Well, they thought he didn't leave a suicide note, but he may have left one, which we'll get into a little bit later. But it seemingly came out of nowhere. And prior to the crime being committed, he had been acting totally normal. People who knew him had no inkling that anything was wrong. There were no warning signs of trouble. Just a couple of days before, maybe even the day before it all happened, Chris had been talking to his friend and neighbor, somebody who lived close by, because the 4th of July holiday was coming up, and typically they got together and they celebrated together, so they had discussed the future holiday and made plans for what they were going to do. They were going to get together and watch fireworks. And he said of this interaction with Chris, this neighbor said of his interaction with Chris, his last interaction with Chris, and I quote, "It was a typical conversation. There were no signs of trouble. So I was just completely shocked about what happened. There was nothing you could look back on that indicated that he wanted to say goodbye." So with no note and no early warning signs, it's left people to literally just have to guess and speculate about what could have caused this tragedy. And one big one was steroids or testosterone abuse. And that's because, well, one, it was not a secret that Chris Benoit used steroids. It wasn't a secret that most professional wrestlers, at least at that time, well, probably, I don't know, used testosterone, used steroids. It was just a thing. And when the house was searched, there was testosterone found in the home after the murder. So it was thought that Chris may have taken this and gone into a roid rage, because taking steroids is linked with uncontrollable anger and psychological issues, which include paranoia. And Chris definitely did have some problems with paranoia, but we'll get into that a little bit later also. The roid rage theory, though, people really still believe that. When I talked to my husband about this case, because he just heard about it, in passing, he has no true crime interest whatsoever. He doesn't like it, actually. But when I brought it up to him, he's like, oh yeah, he went into roid rage. It's something that is commonly believed about this case if you don't know a lot about it. It was actually debunked pretty quickly, because roid rage is exactly what it sounds like. You take them, you get real mad, you go into a real high, real quick. It's like an explosion of rage and anger, but then you come down pretty quick too. It's not the type of thing that would cause a premeditated 3-day long murder-suicide. This took time, this took planning and execution, and it wouldn't be something that roid rage would be able to account for. Does that make sense? Am I making sense here with you today? Hope so. Additionally, the medical examiner ruled that the drug GHB was not present in any of the 3 bodies, and there was no indication that anything in Chris's body would have contributed to his violent behavior that led to his death as well as his wife and son's death. And he just concluded that roid rage was not possible. It wasn't what caused this to happen. The next, or another popular theory, is that alcohol abuse contributed to this murder, because Chris was known to drink, and to drink heavy, both at home and while on the road traveling with the WWF, WWE team. And his friends said that Chris was the type who would often drink more when him and his wife Nancy started to have problems, started to argue, and there'd be tension in the relationship, because he kind of wanted to avoid the situation overall. Just trying to drink his problems away, you know? What they were fighting about, I couldn't be sure. It was rumored that Nancy had accused Chris of being unfaithful and cheating on her. And I could definitely say that if that was the case, and she did believe that, that would definitely be something that could cause the couple to fight quite a bit, and could also then, in turn, cause Chris to drink if there was a lot of fighting. So that is another theory. But there's no alcohol found in the system. So it's like, how is that a theory? I don't know. But some people think that. Another big theory, and it's probably the biggest and most popular theory next to the steroid use theory, is that Chris was suffering from brain damage. That he was suffering concussion-related brain trauma from his continuous untreated concussions that he sustained during his wrestling career, which led to an unstable mental state. Chris was said to be one of the only guys to take a metal chair to the back of the head over and over, and that this was stupid. That was a quote. Can't remember who said it. Another wrestler, but that was said. Chris was known for being a guy who would let you take a folding metal chair and bash him in the back of the head with it. And at the time, during this time in wrestling, this was deemed to be an appropriate thing that you could do. And in addition to that, one of Chris's signature moves was the diving headbutt, which is exactly what it sounds like. He would I watched it. He would get up on the ropes and he would just jump head first into his opponent, taking all of the brunt of that fall with his skull. Performing this maneuver, the diving headbutt, for the length of his 22-year career, the resulting concussions appear to have been the primary cause for Benoit's descent into madness, murder, and suicide. Chris Benoit's father actually gave permission to a doctor at West Virginia University to examine Chris's brain after death. And this doctor was shocked to find what was wrong with his brain. I would say probably not too shocked, because you're going to expect something. But he was blown away just by the extent of the damage. Chris had damage to all 4 lobes of his brain and to his brainstem. This showed the doctor that the damage to Chris's brain would be akin to that of an 85-year-old man with Alzheimer's and CTW, which is chronic traumatic encephalopathy. That's probably not how you pronounce that, but it's a term that's used to describe brain degeneration likely caused by repeated head traumas, and this is something that was found to be present in Chris's brain. So he definitely had a lot going on and a lot of damage to his brain. Several of Chris's friends in the wrestling community actually seemed to believe more along this line, this train of thought, that there was something wrong with Chris's brain and Chris's mind, because they said that he was a quiet man, a calm man, a gentle man, and that he seemed to be suffering from mental illness that they believe stemmed from the death of his best friend of 15 years, who had died just 2 years prior to the murders. In 2005, Chris's best friend and fellow wrestler Eddie Guerrero died suddenly at the young age of, I believe, 38 from complications with his heart, and it really seemed to affect Chris. Chris was interviewed shortly after Eddie's death in 2005, and he said of Eddie, and I quote, "He was the one friend that I had and I could go to and pour my heart out to if I was going through something, if I had a personal issue or a personal problem. He was the guy that I could call and talk to and know that he would understand and he would talk me out of it." He continued later in this interview through tears. Like, the interview is really sad to watch. He gets pretty upset. He cries pretty hard. And he said later in this interview through tears, and I quote, "Eddie, you made such a good impression on my life, and I want to thank you for everything you've ever given me. And I want to thank you from my heart and tell you that I love you, and I'll never forget you, and we'll see each other again. I love you, Eddie." And that interview for me was super weird to watch and kind of hard to watch, because I found that it really humanized Chris Benoit for me. And I like, in general, in my videos, to humanize and feel sympathy for the victims. That's what I'm comfortable with. But I felt myself in watching this interview feel that way for Chris Benoit, which was an odd thing because then I had to kind of pull myself back and be like, this is also the man who brutally murdered his wife and his son. But something about watching it humanized him a lot as well. And it was just an odd feeling that I didn't like that much. Gotta be honest. Anyways, after the murders, a journal was actually found where Chris, since Eddie had died, had been writing letters to Eddie and keeping them in this journal. And what was in the journal hasn't been released, but Chris's dad has said in reading it, he can feel his son's descent into madness. And in one of the entries, it said something along the lines of Chris saying that he will see Eddie soon. Additionally, Chris was suffering from some pretty bad paranoia. He, refused to go to church anymore, even for his friend's funeral, because he hated and didn't trust religion. He was controlling of his wife and would not let her out of the house after dark, and just wouldn't let his son go out of the house alone at all, because he felt like him and his family were being watched. So it definitely feels like something was wrong with Chris's head. Something wasn't going on right upstairs at the time that the murders happened. And it's tough, though, because it clearly was premeditated also. I mean, he took the time to do it over several days, which that would give you time to kind of think about what you're doing and choose not to do it. He also made the effort to leave the Bibles next to the bodies, and in doing an investigation after the murders, it was found that Chris had been on the computer searching the best ways and the easiest ways to break your own neck. So now, why he did this, we may never know. I mean, the letters that he wrote to Eddie have never been released. And okay. And I said before that there was sort of a suicide note found. So what happened here is that after Chris killed himself and killed his family, his personal effects, a lot of them were sent to his first wife, Martina. And when Martina received all these items, among these items was a Bible. And when she looked in this Bible, she found a note inside of it. Now, how police missed this, I don't know. You would think that since there were Bibles next to the two bodies, that a Bible in the house at all would kind of get your attention, but somehow this was missed. And because it was missed, it ended up in the home of Martina, and what it said hasn't been released, but it's believed by those who loved him, his family, his friends, those who have read it, that this was a suicide note. But to this day, no one really knows what happened, what made him snap, because the one man who holds the answers to these questions killed himself and took the people he cherished the most in the world with him. It's just really sad, dude. It really does seem like no one had any idea that something like this could happen, that it really did come so out of left field for most people. But then again, there must have been something wrong and something going on in the family because of the fact that Nancy did try to get a restraining order and tried to divorce Chris at some point. So there was clearly something going on behind closed doors, and it just shows you that you never know what is happening when people go home at night and what they're dealing with and what their lives are like, because no one expected this to happen. But clearly there was something going on, it's just so messed up. And I can't even imagine being somebody who knew them, that would just be so hard to be a friend or a family member of any of them and to just have to deal with this. And then imagine being a fan. I wasn't, so I can't really relate to it in that way, but being a fan of Chris Benoit's and watching him come up and seeing his accomplishments and enjoying watching him, and then having to separate that from what he did, or try to just no longer enjoy him anymore. And then imagine the young kids who looked up to him as a wrestling icon, the way that he looked up to other people. It's just really sad. And I can't imagine what that's like. I did ask my husband, I was what he felt since he was a fan, and he was just he didn't really know how to answer it. He was just kind of I don't know. There was clearly something going on with him. That's all there is that there was clearly something wrong. And you never know what people are going through, is what he said. And you never know what's going on in people's heads. And he brought up Robin Williams, and we kind of talked about that a little bit. And it's just really sad. It's tragic all around, as most of these cases we discuss are. But anyways, guys, that completes this video. I hope you found it interesting and informative, and it gave you all the information you would want when looking into this case. And of course, I want to just thank you for remembering Nancy and Daniel with me today, because what happened to them is just so fucked up. I try not to put myself in those situations, but then I have to a little bit so that I can kind of feel what they, not feel what they would feel, but just like, it makes you care more to humanize these people and put yourself in those positions. And I think about Nancy, and I think about this being her husband, the person she loved and she married and she had a kid with, and then I think about him kneeling on her back as he rips up a cord on her neck from behind, killing her, and her knowing that her son is in the house while this is happening, and how just absolutely fucked up that must have been. And then I think about Daniel, and I think about, he's 7 years old, and I hope he was drugged. I really do, because when I start to think about him being awake during it and like knowing that his dad's like choking him from behind, it gets to be too much that I can't even deal with it. It's just, nope. Anyways, please let me know down below of any cases you would like to see me cover in the future. As this case indicates, anytime you leave a suggestion, I put it down with your name next to it to give you a shout out, because I know you're filled with good ideas and good taste. Otherwise, you would not be here. And I love to see your suggestions, because you introduce me to cases that I may not have heard of, and then I can look into them and ruin my day, you know, but learn. Of course, don't forget to join the Brat Pack by subscribing and ringing that bell, because I put out a new video every single week, and I would love to hang out with you. Yes, you, specifically you. And if you want to hang out more consistently, you can check the description box for all my social media, as well as all of the products I use on my face are listed below: lipstick, earrings, nail polish, and I also have a link to my merch shop, where if you want to get some merch, I have this shirt and one other shirt. They're both pretty cool, and all the reviews are great. I'm so happy that you guys are liking it. You guys are so cool, man. And with all of that said, I just want to thank you for being here when you could literally be anywhere else in the world. That is tight. You are tight. Please stay safe and be a better person than you were yesterday, and I hope to see you in my next video. Bye.